So the first chapter is about distributional maps. I'm sure when it comes to geography, you all must have seen some or the other maps. You also have map work in school, so you are quite familiar with maps. But what we are familiar with is just plotting some things or plotting some areas on the map. But other than that, we find maps everywhere. Maps are very convenient. They ease out all the processes a lot. They give us directions and a lot of things. For example, even if we go to a mall, we can find the map of the mall on all their floors, which helps us to navigate better. So this is what maps do. They give us a lot of information. Maps can be called a storehouse of information. We can get the directions. If you see maps, there will always be a legend at the bottom of the map showing you the directions, pointing out north mainly. So that's what the map. Other than that, with a map there is always a key. So either there are some colors, there are patterns, or something that has to be denoted so that you can find it on the map. So these are keys on the maps. They are very important. um, Now maps can be used for a whole lot of purposes, to study the population, to study the rainfall, to study the literacy rate, or which language is most commonly spoken. So we can have maps for everything. Now, when we are talking about these maps which are designed on some specific themes, they are called thematic maps. The word thematic comes from the word theme, which means that every map is designed on the basis of some special theme. So a thematic map is going to show us only one particular criteria that we are looking at. So that's what thematic maps are about. Okay. Now, through these thematic maps, a lot of variables are distributed all over the map that we are looking at. And therefore, these maps are also called distributional maps. Okay, so we are going to look at three main types of distributional maps today: the dot method, choropleth method, and the isopleth method. So let us just look at this. 1 second. Okay. So these are the maps. First of all, we are looking at the dot method maps. As you can see, we have dots over here. So this is right out of your textbook, this picture. So it's showing you that the map is about Amravati district of Maharashtra. And this map particularly is a thematic map. Now the theme over here is distribution of population. As I said, there is always a legend on the map which shows you that this is the north direction pointing upwards, and this is the scale of the map: 0, 10, and 20 kilometers. However, we are not so concerned about this right now. Now, Amravati is again broken up into many small talukas and districts. Um, Here, it's telling you that rural population, each dot has 10,000 population. So all the red dots are the rural areas. Okay. So if you see this area over here, slightly, let's say towards the northern part, this is very sparsely populated. As you can see, Amravati is the most densely populated. So this is what a dot method does. The more, the higher the concentration of dots in that area, the higher that variable will be. So this means that Amravati has the highest and the densest population in this region. Now over here you can see each dot has 10,000 population. So for example, if we say in Achalpur, what is the population in Achalpur? You can, count the number of red dots and then maybe say that, that is the population. So if, for example, you have uh, two dots in this area, the population will be 20,000 because one red dot is representing 10,000 population. So this is for the rural. When we say population of main cities, these are the urban centers. For that, we are using bigger circles or bigger dots because you all know that urban areas are always more populated or highly populated than the rural areas. So now again, you see that the dots vary in size. Amravati has the biggest dot. So this dot is telling you 5 lakh. So it means this is 5 lakh population. Achalpur has 2 lakh population. And Varud and this Anjangaon, Surji are almost 1 lakh population each. So this is how we study dot maps. Now, how is a dot map made? First of all, for making any type of map, we need to collect the statistical data. The statistics, put it into class intervals and then decide. So first, we gather the statistical data and get the exact size of our variable or the thing that we are studying. After that, the value of every dot is determined. Whether I want one dot to represent 1,000 population, whether I want one dot to represent 100 population, 1 lakh population, 10,000 population. So depending on the statistics I have or the statistical data that I have collected, what we will do is we will determine the value of that dot. So accordingly, once the value of the dot is determined, then I will set the lowest and the highest values that I want to consider. Sorry. So, okay, after that we have the lowest and the highest values that we consider. Now, very important is when we are making a dot map, we should keep in mind that the dot of, each dot should be of a uniform size. It should be same, exactly identical. So unless I am denoting it this way, like see, the pink dots are getting bigger. But if I have to make two 5 lakh dots, they should be the exact same in size. Like you can look at the red dots for the rural area. They are very uniform. Okay. Every dot is the same size. Now, generally, whenever we are using dot method specifically for population, for the rural areas, we use dots like it is done over here. And for the urban areas, we use circles. Okay, like the pink ones that you have. So they are like solid colored circles that we have. So this is a dot method map. So the most important thing to remember over here is that the dot should be of uniform size. We collect the statistical data and then we determine the value of the dot and then the highest and the lowest value. So for this particular map, the lowest value that we have fixed is 10,000 population and the highest value that we have fixed is 5 lakh population. So this is Amravati. Now here we have a similar map for Kolhapur. Again, it is the distribution of population. So you see over here now, the index is different, right? The key. Here, each red dot is representing 5,000 population. Here it was 10,000. See, this is 10,000. This over here is 5,000 population. And population of major cities, here you have 50,000, 1, 2, 5, 10 and 20 lakhs. So this is Kolhapur. You can see it's the most densely populated. As we see the legend, we see the northeastern part of this area that we see is more densely populated, and towards the western side, it's very sparsely populated. Okay, so these are our dot method maps. Now these are another few example of dot method maps. See, here the key says 1 dot equals 1,000 people. This is the map of Australia. So you can see this eastern side of the island is very densely populated, especially the coastal areas. As we go towards the interior of the continent, there's hardly any population over here. They're mainly concentrated on the eastern coastline. Even the western coastline is not so populated. This is because the physiography of Australia is such that people prefer to stay on the coastlines. So your 1 dot is 1,000 population. If you have to calculate the total population, say of the Northern Territory, this part, you will calculate the number of dots and multiply it with 1,000. You would get your answer as to what will be the population of the territory that we are looking at. Again here, okay, it's a similar thing. Dot method map. Again, if you see this eastern side is quite populated. Areas like these very dense. You can hardly make out how many dots are there. So in this case, counting is very difficult. Again, look at this area, extremely populated. These areas over here, or let's say this area and this area. Here it says 1 dot is equal to 50,000 population. So these are very densely populated, whereas over here you see they are hardly populated. No one there. So these are the dot maps that we did. Okay, so represented with the number of dots. Now moving on to the next method, that is the choropleth method. Now in the choropleth method, there are two options that we use. Okay, so one is this, which is colors. Here you can see we are using tints and shades of the same color. So these are tints and shades of pink. So the brightest or the darkest color represents the highest value, and the lightest shade or the lightest color that you can see represents the lowest value. So this is how it goes even for your C. The darkest color has the highest value, and the lightest color over here that has the lowest value. Now here another example of a choropleth map is, here we use patterns. So instead of colors we can also use patterns for this. Okay, so as again over here you notice when we gather the statistical data, we just estimate the highest and the lowest values. The highest values, the patterns are more dense, and when it comes to the lowest, the pattern is very free, it's very open. So this is how it goes. Okay, so here for choropleth methods, again we have surveys, and then we obtain data through measurement, divide them into classes or your class intervals like these over here, and then we divide that into shades and patterns. So it's up to you if you can use a shade or a pattern, and you can use any particular color. Okay, so here we are looking at the color pink. So again, just notice the class intervals over here. Amravati has the density of population more than 400. So the most heavily populated. Chikaldara is the least populated, less than 100 per square kilometer. This is the measurement that we are using for this. Looking at next, this is the population density of Asia of the year 2009. So here you can say Bangladesh has the highest population. This is the statistics of the year 2009. People per square kilometer. Bangladesh has 700 plus people per square kilometer. That's the darkest. Then it's followed by India. So that is somewhere between 301 and 699 people per square kilometer. And then as we go to Russia and all these countries, it becomes a little less. So this is what choropleth maps do. Even here, this is the female population of this particular area. This is just a pictorial representation for you to understand. So as you see again, for the white parts over here, this is a small white part, this and this one over here. There is no data. So there are some areas which maybe because of some reasons, physiography or some other social factors inaccessible. And so we have no data for that. But again here, I just wanted to observe the same thing, that the lowest value has the lightest color and the highest value has the darkest color. So this is how we use colors when we are using a map or preparing a map using the choropleth method. Now next, this again is the same choropleth method only, but instead of colors we are using patterns. So as I told you before, areas which have heavy population or the highest value have very dense patterns, and the areas which have a lesser value or the lowest values, the patterns are very free, they're very open. So that's what you can see on this map again over here. Amravati has a population of more than 400 people per square kilometer, whereas Chikaldara is less than 100 people per square kilometer. This is again for the Kolhapur district. We had seen the same map in the dot method about the population, but here it is specifically about the density of rural population. Okay, so if you see, dots are less than 200 people per square kilometer. Where we have lines, it is 201 to 400. And this crisscross pattern, the squarish pattern that we have, has more than 400 people per square kilometer. Now here, coming to the last method, it's the isopleth method. Now isopleth method is mainly used for showing rainfall, temperature, snowfall, all these things. Why? Because what we are doing over here is we are connecting the areas with the same value. So if you see, this has a color. For the isopleth maps, we use a color and we draw these lines which show equal value. So say this part on the eastern front, here this receives 900 mm of rainfall, the average rainfall. Then here we have 800, this again goes to 900, then 1000, 1100, 1200, 1300. So this area, the northernmost area, experiences the heaviest rainfall. And this area in the center and this one, the western part, receives the least rainfall. So this is what isopleth maps do. They connect areas having the same values. So this can also be used to show the altitude. This again is the average rainfall of the Kolhapur district. This was the Amravati one. This is the Kolhapur one. If you can see here, the western part gets the highest rainfall, which is around 2400 mm. Then it reduces as we go towards the east. The amount of rainfall keeps on decreasing. So this is how we show the isopleth maps. For isopleth, we use colors. But apart from colors, the most important thing is we use these lines which connect areas with the same values. This is another example of your isopleth map. Okay. So you see, these are line circles connecting the same values. This is showing the altitude. Again, there is one more thing that we need to notice over here. If the lines are closely drawn, it means that the difference is it's a steep slope, or the altitude is very steep. And if the lines are very far away from each other, it means that the slope is very gentle. Okay, so this was it about maps. Okay, Esas, in the book, there is one mistake. You're on page number 3, figure 1.2b. The density of population of Amravati district, the pattern, it is written isopleth maps, but actually it is a chloropleth map. All right. So, all right. Okay, so coming back, these are the 3 type of maps that you have done today. Distribution maps called thematic maps. First is the dot method map, where we use dots. So each dot has a value. Then we come to the chloropleth method. So in chloropleth method, either you can use shades or you can use patterns. And last is the isopleth map, which means that we are connecting areas with the same values. Okay. Okay. So this was the chapter on distributional maps. So I'm just giving you 2 minutes. Just think over what we have done. If there are any doubts, we'll get them clear and then we will move on to the next chapter. Any doubts, please type them. All right, so next move on to the next chapter. It is called the endogenetic movements. Now what we are doing, we are referring to the movements that happen within the Earth's crust and over on top of the Earth's crust. So that is the internal and the external movements of the Earth. And how do they lead to the making up of landforms, or how they trigger events like earthquakes and volcanoes. So now that's what we are going to do over the next hour. Okay, Adinath, the map on page number 6 is not any particular type of map. They've just asked you, it's an activity that you do. You have to trace it. You have to look at the height of the region and you have to look at the table that they've given down. That is Akkaluwa, Taloda, Akrani, Shada, Nandurbar, Navapur. You have to look at that, the rural population. You have to fix the size of the dot and then you have to work on the map. You have to trace this out and do it. This is a normal physiography map which is showing you the physiographical areas, whether it's a mountainous region, whether it's a farming land. So it's a very general map that what they have shown you over there. You do not need to do any of these activities because from the NTSC point of view, these activities are not important. These are for those who are studying the state board. Now, you just need to know what is isopleth, chloropleth, dot method. That's it. You do not need to know anything else over here. So you can ignore this activity in your book. But if you really feel like doing it, you can carry on and do it. But map making, not part of our syllabus right now. All right, so let's proceed to the next chapter. So here we are going to look at the internal and the external movements. Okay, so the first chapter we are going to cover the endogenetic movements, and then we will move to the exogenetic movements, which is spread over 2 chapters. So now looking at this, let us look at a very basic flow chart of the Earth's movement. Now these things will become slightly clear as we move on with the chapter. But basically, Earth's movements are divided into 2 broad categories: endogenetic movements and exogenetic movements. Endogenetic movements are the movements that happen inside the Earth's crust. Okay, they are the internal movements of the Earth, which take place in the crust, the mantle. So these are the movements that happen inside the Earth's crust. Exogenetic movements are the movements that happen on the external side, that is above the Earth's crust or on the Earth's crust. So exogenetic are external, Endogenetic are internal. Coming right now, for the chapter that we are doing right now, we are going to concentrate on the endogenetic movements, that is the internal movements of the Earth's crust. Okay, so let us look at only the endogenetic, also known as endogenic and exogenic, or endogenetic and exogenic. All the terms are correct. Now, when we are looking only at the endogenic, that is the internal processes of the Earth, there are two types of movements that happen inside the Earth's crust. Some movements are slow and some movements are sudden. They happen very quickly. The slow movements are also called diastrophism. Now, it's very easy to understand the sudden movements as compared to the slow movements. Sudden movements, when they make them jaldi se, it starts, there is some movement of the plates inside or something that triggers some movements. So the sudden movements, there are two types of sudden movements that we have over here. One are earthquakes, which we all are familiar with, which is like shaking of the earth. And the second is volcano eruptions or volcanic eruptions. So these are the sudden movements that happen, and the results of sudden movements are very devastating. Okay, so we'll come to this a little later. Now coming and concentrating on the slow movements. Now the slow movements that happen inside the earth are also called diastrophism. So diastrophism is something that's very slow. So now these slow movements are further categorized into two categories, vertical and horizontal. वर्टिकल इज मीन्स या तो वो अपवर्ड जाएगा या डाउनवर्ड जाएगा, या वो ऊपर आएगा या वो नीचे जाएगा. सो दैट इज वर्टिकल, सीधा मूवमेंट. ओके, नाउ again these vertical movements are also called epirogenic or continent building movements. So what happens is, because the movement is upward or downward, if a landmass of earth is coming upwards, the result will be a continent. That is why it is also called continent building. And if a landmass of earth sinks down, if the movement is downward, it will go down and form a part of the seabed or the ocean bed. So it's a vertical movement, straight upar nahi to niche. So up and down. That is your vertical or epirogenic movements. Next are my horizontal movements. They are known as orogenic. Now horizontal में वो एक ही line में आएगा, या तो they will come towards each other or they will go away from each other. Okay. Now look, horizontal are of two types, forces of compression and forces of tension. When we are talking about compression, we have these movements or rays coming towards each other. The movement is they are coming to each other. What happens when they come towards each other? It will result in the rise of a landmass. It will come up. So if you put your fingers next to each other, if you touch the fingers of both the hands and you exert more pressure, what is going to happen? Your fingers will come up. So that's what happens exactly. Now these type of mountains are called fold mountains. Now next is forces of tension. That is when the plates are moving away from each other. What happens when you're moving away? See, there is a fault over here. There is a hollow over here. So in geography, whenever we are referring to the word fault, okay, technically in geography the word fault means a gap. कहीं तो कुछ गैप है, या तो प्लेट्स के बीच में गैप है, या रॉक्स के, if you are talking about rocks, तो रॉक्स के बीच में गैप है. If you are talking about plates, when they are diverting away from each other, there will be a fault over here. So it's like a cavity inside a rock or inside the earth. So when they move away from each other, what happens is this area will sink down or it will come up. It depends. If it goes down, the result is a valley. If it comes up, the result is a mountain. So these are the endogenic processes. So just redoing it quickly. Endogenetic movements are of two types, slow and sudden. Slow is also called diastrophism. Now slow movements can be vertical or horizontal. Vertical will be upward and downward, and horizontal will be either convergent, that is coming to each other, or divergent, that is going away from each other. Okay. So let's start with the first. Fold mountains. Now, as I said, see, fold mountains are a result of this compression. these coming towards each other, converging. The plates are converging. What happens? There will be a movement when they will collide. So either they'll go up, most of the times they go up. So what happens is sediments, magma, etc. So always remember, sediments are your soft rock. Hard rock is very difficult to, uh, for hard rock, it's quite difficult for the pressure to act. But for softer rocks, it's very easy for the pressure to act. So sediments and etc. it is forced upwards, and then the result is fold mountains. Our Himalayas, Aravallis, or the Rockies, Andes, they are all examples of your fold mountains. Okay. What happens is, at a point the pressure is too much to bear and the landmass will be forced upwards. So when it's forced upwards, we have fold mountains, the resulting out of the fold over here. So these are some examples of fold mountains. So you see, they look very stratified. There are layers that you can see. You can very clearly mark out the layers in fold mountains. Also look at this. See, very easy. Looks like a layer. Over here, you can make out their different layers, even over here. And you can see they are not very even. See, from here it's straight, but from here it's kind of wavy. So these are the fold mountains, which is a result of compression. Okay, so this is how they look. Now, coming to block mountains. Now, block mountains happen because of your horizontal movement. What happens is, there are faults. Faults always exist. Gaps always exist, irrespective of the the faults converging or diverging. There are always some faults that exist in the Earth's crust. Now, what happens right now is, see, sometimes when they are coming towards each other, it might result in the upward movement of the center part, which will give rise to block mountains. So because of the faults and the pressure acting on the faults, if the landmass goes up, the result is a block mountain. And if it goes down, the result is a rift valley. So see, this is an example of block mountains. So if you see, there is not much of a difference between fold mountains and block mountains. Only in block mountains, the pressure is higher and the rock is harder. Whereas if we talk about fold mountains, the rocks are softer, and compared to block mountains, the pressure is a little less. And also, the tops of block mountains are relatively flat. Okay. So if you see, notice the difference. This has a shape like this, like a mountain. It's not flat. Even this one. Okay, it's like going up from here, and then from the other side, it's going down again. But over here, if you look, the top is like flat. It does not have a peak. So these are block mountains. They look like a block, and so they are named like that. Now, rift valleys happen when the horizontal movements, they are moving away. Okay, when they move away, when they are diverging, that is the time what happens is a gap is created over here. The landmass will fall down, thus forming a valley. So this is how a valley looks. These are faults. They're just going up and down, and the result is a valley. So this over here, this line, this gully kind of a thing that you see, this is an example of a rift valley. So it's like when they separated, this has just gone down. And this are in the process. If you see these big cracks over here, these are in the process of weathering. So slowly, steadily, they will definitely again erode, and the valley would keep on becoming wider. Okay. So these are the movements which are a result of your horizontal and vertical movements. You would have also done it last year, convergent boundary and divergent boundary. So this is when we are talking about the valleys. So when we are talking about the slow movements, these are the slow movements that we spoke about. looking at this part over here again, diastrophism, vertical movements and horizontal movements. Vertical movements means if though possibility, either if the land is lifted up, it will, the result will be a continent. If it is if the movement is downward, that land will become a part of the seabed or the ocean bed. Horizontal movements, we either have forces of compression or tension, that is plates coming towards each other or going away from each other. When it comes towards each other, the result is fold mountains and block mountains, and when it goes away from each other, the result is a valley. So this is what it is when we are talking about the slow movements. Now we need to talk about the sudden movements. Now sudden movements are also a result of the plates in the interior of the earth. Whenever there are sudden movements, the result is very destructive, very devastating. It endangers human life because it triggers tsunamis, it triggers volcanoes, it triggers earthquakes. So very difficult to stop all of this. Now when we were talking about diastrophism or the slow movements, okay, we were talking about the making of landforms. So at this time, landforms are made, like you have block mountains, you have fold mountains, and you have valleys. But in the case of sudden movements, there are no landforms that are formed. There are sudden movements like earthquakes, volcanoes, and these are the two main things that we are looking at right now. First, we go to earthquakes. So I'm sure you all know what earthquakes are. The trembling of the ground, the shaking of the ground. When what happens is when there's a lot of tension inside the earth's crust, a lot of energy is released, because whenever there's tension, there has to be a release somewhere, so it releases in the form of the movement of the plates. Now what could be the reasons of the earthquake? Either the plates are moving, they're just moving, yahan se wahan, not touching each other but just in general moving. Second possibility is that they are colliding matlab dashing against each other, or the plates are sliding below each other, एक के नीचे जा रहा है, एक किसी के ऊपर जा रहा है. And last is volcanic eruptions. Now volcanoes can trigger earthquakes and earthquakes can trigger volcanoes. So these are both the possibilities, they both go hand in hand. If let's say there is some area which has an active volcano and there's a tremendous earthquake over there, it will definitely be followed by a volcanic eruption. Or if there is a volcanic eruption in some area, it will definitely face some amount of trembling of the ground, which would be called an earthquake. Okay, so see, it's like an earthquake is the shaking of the ground caused by sudden motions along faults or fractures in the earth's crust. So faults में, plates में कभी भी कुछ भी movement हुआ, so there's going to be an earthquake. So this is what a fault looks like, in the earth's crust when it's not leveled. These are your plates. Seismic waves we'll do a little later. These are the plates on the surface of the earth or just below the surface when they are moving and it's triggering earthquake. Now some of the things that we need to understand over here is कि earth के अंदर जहां से earthquake trigger हुआ है, that is the focus or the hypocenter. This is the point where the earthquake actually starts, the trigger point from where it has begun, the focus or the hypocenter. Now the point on the surface of the earth exactly above the focus or the hypocenter is called your epicenter. That's the point of the surface where the earth, directly it's above the focus, and the effect of the earthquake will be maximum on and around the epicenter. So as we keep on moving away from the epicenter, the loss will be a little less, the trembling felt will be a little less. So it will be the highest at the epicenter and it will keep on going down as we move away from it. So focus and epicenter are very important whenever we are talking about an earthquake. Okay. Now, earthquake is measured by the Richter scale. It's measured in terms of magnitude, which describes your intensity. Now, the first earthquake observatory in India was set up at Alipur, Kolkata in the year 1898. And since then, we have been recording earthquake. We are statistically recording earthquakes, trying to study. There are many observatories which can also predict whether an earthquake would take place or no. So in this cases, it becomes easier for us to evacuate the areas in advance. Now, the energy that is released by the earthquake or released at the focus and the epicenter is measured in the terms of seismic waves. We look at it in the terms of seismic waves. This is how the energy is transmitted or how the energy is released in the term of seismic waves. Now, there are three types of seismic waves that we have. P wave or primary waves, these are the first waves to be released. The last is the S wave, or sorry, the second is the S wave or the secondary wave. It follows the primary wave. And last are the surface waves. The surface waves are the most destructive of all the three. Now, coming to the primary waves, okay, they travel very fast and they travel to and fro. See, like this. They keep on traveling to and fro. You can see these arrows over here on top of the green area. If you look, this is the line and this is the arrowhead. So they keep on moving to and fro, to and fro. That is why the P waves or the primary waves are also called forward backward waves. These waves can transmit or they can travel through all the three states, that is liquid, gas and solid. While traveling through liquids, their direction is changed. Once the primary waves are done, then it gives rise to the secondary or S waves. Now they scatter in all directions. If you see, this is the arrow, upward, downward, upward, downward. So now if you can see, look at the movement. It's like, like a wavy thing that the picture looks like this. So these are the kind of tremors that it gives. They just move up and down, which causes more destruction. So see, this is straight. Here it is down, up, down, up, down, up, and down and up. So this is the pattern that the waves follow, up, down, up, down, up, down. They travel only through solid. In liquids, they get absorbed. So when we have experienced the buildings shaking, it's mainly because of the S waves when they move up and down like this. Now the last to appear are the surface waves. They travel in circles. You can see the arrows over here, how they are traveling. They are the most destructive. They keep on moving like this and they cause maximum destruction to life and property. So these are the three types of waves: primary, secondary and surface. Surface waves are also called L waves. All right. Now next, coming to seismograph and seismogram. See over here also, if you see, you can see the P waves. There's not so much of movement. Becomes slightly stronger when we come to the S wave. And then look at the surface waves. So you can imagine the amount of destruction that they cause, the surface waves. Sorry. Now seismograph is the instrument. This instrument is called the seismograph. So it's like, this base is set onto the ground. You can also read it along the image. When the earth moves, the device also moves, and there is this rotating drum. This is a weight, and this is how the pen will move. So when you detach this paper, this is how it looks when the paper is flat. So this is the seismogram. The seismogram is the reading. The seismograph is the device. Okay. Now the seismogram is measured in terms of magnitude, that is the Richter scale. So how many Richter scale? Whenever we are talking about some earthquake, we said it has recorded a magnitude of 4 or recorded a magnitude of 9. If the magnitude is higher than 5.5, it means that the earthquake has been really very bad. So the Richter number that we read, that is 5, 9, etc., that is the total energy that has been released, and it describes the intensity of the earthquake. The Richter number was named after Mr. Charles F. Richter, who was an American geologist in the 1930s. So remember, don't get confused because the name is like a graph. We would think that the graph is the reading. No, the seismograph is the instrument, the seismogram is the reading, and the reading is expressed in the form of magnitude, which is known as Richter scale. The magnitude is measured on the Richter scale. Now, the biggest earthquake experienced anywhere in the world was on 22nd of May 1960, 1960 at Valdivia in Chile. The magnitude was 9.5. In India, in the year 2004, December 2004, there was a very bad earthquake in the Indian Ocean. The magnitude was 9.1 to 9.3, which caused the tsunami. Apart from that, some earthquakes, severe earthquakes that our country has experienced are the earthquake in Kashmir in 2005, that was 7.6, Bihar and Nepal, which was 8.7. In the year 1934, in 2001 in Gujarat, it was 7.7. The Bhuj earthquake. December, and in which year? December 2004. The earthquake that happened in the Indian Ocean. Triggered the tsunami. Okay, tsunami brought a lot of destruction to the southern coastline. Okay, now we know that the devastation, the destruction caused by earthquakes is enormous. This is the road which has completely cracked up. It's fallen down from here. You can see the fence is all bent. The road is still safe somehow. The house, sorry, is somehow safe. Yeah, this is the photo of the buildings that have fallen down. So they just fall like that. So this is the amount of, the destruction that an earthquake can cause. So if you can imagine, if there are people inside this building when the earthquake was caused, you can only imagine how many people died. So, it leads to more cracks, fractures, faults in the earth's crust, leads to landslides if there's a heavy earthquake. If you are near a mountain or somewhere, it can force the land to slide. Groundwater changes its course. There are tsunamis in areas where we have snowfall and ice. It leads to avalanches. There's loss of life, loss of human life, loss of property, loss of animal life too. Transport gets disrupted. Now, if the situation is something like this, imagine you would have to repair the road first and then do other things. So transport gets disrupted, communication falls off, because if we have something like the wires, etc., get fallen, your mobile towers, etc., would be damaged during this. So earthquakes lead to a lot of destruction. And then last we come to volcanoes. Now, this is what a volcano is. In India, we just have one active volcano in the Andaman and Nicobar area in the Barren Islands. Now, to understand the anatomy of a volcano, what happens is this is the magma chamber over here. It is molten rock when you have the crust, mantle, and the core. Okay, this is the molten rock deep inside the earth. Now, what happens is when there are some movements inside, it triggers and it completely shoots up from here. Now you have, this is the main vent through which the magma flows out. Now inside it is called magma, and the moment it comes out, it is known as lava. Now what is released from here? You have ash, uh, okay, there is ash, there is lava, and okay, there's gas, there's steam, there's dust, a lot of things that are thrown out along with the lava. Now there are two types of volcanoes. One is a conical volcano or a central type of volcano, and the other is the fissure type of volcano. Just one difference, everything stays the same. Basically, lava comes out along with steam, gas, dust, ash. In a conical type of volcano, the volcano will just burst from the top of the mountain, the top of that area. It will just jump out from there. In a fissure type volcano, what happens is there are some cracks over here on the sides. So this is how it comes, it comes out from all the areas, from the sides as well. That is known as a fissure type volcano. Because there are cracks, so the magma is also pushed sideways and then it needs a release. So it comes out from the other smaller openings. So that is a fissure type volcano, and other than that, it's a conical type of volcano. Now, depending on the periodicity of their, see, this is the crater from where the conical volcano, it will, just come out from here. In case there are cracks, which are known as fissures, then it will come out from all the other possible directions. That is known as a fissure type volcano. Now, talking about the periodicity of eruptions, there are three types of volcanoes. We have active volcanoes, dormant volcanoes, and extinct volcanoes. Now, if the volcanoes erupt regularly, we call them active volcanoes. If they have not erupted since a very long time, but they might become active all of a sudden, we are calling them dormant volcanoes. And volcanoes where there is no sign of eruption and we know that it is not likely to erupt, we call them extinct volcanoes. Okay. Now, again, the effects of volcano are very far reaching, very bad, leads to loss of life, property. It will also trigger tsunamis because the pressure on the earth is extreme at this time. It will lead to imbalance in the environment. Land becomes infertile. See, magma, the lava will flow out like this. So all the forests around this would get burned. Any vegetation that is grown will be burned. If animals are not rescued on time, they will also burn to death. Okay, this land will become infertile. The only positive thing about the bursting of volcanoes is that it keeps the rock cycle alive. That is, when the lava will cool and solidify, they will give rise to igneous rocks. So igneous rocks are the primary rocks. So that from the igneous rocks, then they become sedimentary and then metamorphic. So bursting of volcanoes, the only good thing that it does is keeps the rock cycle alive. So this earthquake and this is the Pacific Ring of Fire. Now the Pacific Ring of Fire, here the volcanoes as well as earthquakes take place a lot. So this is known as the Pacific Ring of Fire. Here we have a lot of earthquakes happening, and because of that a lot of volcanic eruptions also. Now we need to remember that volcanoes ऐसा नहीं है सिर्फ earth पे ही है. They can also be on the ocean beds. Volcanoes can also be on the ocean beds down. Okay, so this is it when it comes to the endogenetic processes. So the endogenetic processes mainly processes that happen inside the surface of the earth. Next, we need to move on to the exogenetic processes. The exogenetic processes are the processes that take place on the surface of the earth. These are the external things that happen. Now, they will always give rise to some or the other type of landforms. So come on again, I'm giving you 2 minutes. Any doubts on this chapter? Rift zone. Esa, there's nothing like a rift zone. It's the Pacific Ring of Fire. It's the most active area for volcanoes and earthquakes. Okay, so that's the place, rift zone, where volcanoes are very active and there are many cracks over there, so lava can flow out. Three types of waves. These are the primary, secondary, and the surface waves. Primary waves are the first waves that arise. They go forward and backward, travel through all the three mediums. They are the least destructive. Second, we come to the surface waves. Here they move up and down, up and down. Okay, so they move up and down, because of which they cause a lot of destruction. And the last is the surface waves or the L waves. They move in a circular direction, causing the most massive destruction. The last wave of destruction, you can say, is brought about by the surface waves. Next question, formation of Sayadri mountain. It will be an example of a block mountain, though. Sayadri is a part of the Western Ghats. So still people are not so clear on that. But yes, we can say it's type of a block mountain. How a block mountain is formed? When the waves are coming towards each other, when the plates are coming towards each other, there will be a moment where they will touch each other, and when these plates touch each other, uske upar jo bhi area hota hai, there is a lot of pressure, so the hard rock is also forced to come up. So when it comes up, it gives rise to a block mountain. So block mountains are very flat at their top. The only difference between fold mountains and block mountains is the type of stone. Fold mountain is soft rock, block mountain is hard rock. So Adinath, I hope I'm clear on the type of waves. Soham, uh, if the Soyadri mountains, mostly a block mountain, we can say. Okay, Adinath. Aisas, the block mountain is formed. I've said that to you. All right. So now here we were mainly looking at the endogenetic processes, that was the internal processes of the earth. Now we are looking at the exogenetic processes, that are the external movements that happen on the earth's surface. Now exogenetic movements are a little more interesting than the endogenetic movements. Exogenetic, as we all know, exogenic or exogenetic, this is the part one, happens on the surface of the earth. Now, when we are talking about exogenic processes, four main things that we need to look at: weathering, erosion, deposition. You have all known this, you have done it over and over again in geography. Weathering होता है, जो weathered material होता है, उसका erosion होता है. It will flow down somewhere, or it will go somewhere. That is erosion. And once the erosion is done, all the silt, the gravel, the sand, the clay has to be deposited somewhere. So we are going to do erosion and deposition in the next chapter. Right now in this chapter, part one, we are going to do weathering and we are going to do mass movement. So first, coming to weathering. What do you mean by weathering? Okay. Weathering means the breaking down, or it means the decomposition of rocks. So we have big rocks, like for example, mountains or other rocks on the valley, in the valley. So all these things, there are rocks everywhere. Their disintegration, their breaking down, their decomposition is known as weathering. So now, when we talk about weathering, there are three main types of weathering. Physical weathering, which is also known as mechanical weathering, chemical weathering, and biological weathering. We will just look at this, why physical weathering takes place, how chemical weathering takes place and what is biological weathering. So basically, when a rock is breaking down into small fragments, known as weathering. नेक्स्ट मास मूवमेंट्स. नाउ द वेदर्ड मटेरियल जो है, कभी कभी अगर इरोजन नहीं होता है तो उसका मास मूवमेंट होता है. These mass movements can be slow or they can be very fast. We will also look at this in this chapter. So here we are drawing a line. Erosion and deposition, we will be doing it on the next chapter. But just to explain how this goes is, weathering ho gaya. Now suppose there is a rock, okay, it has broken down into smaller fragments and it is staying over there. That is known as weathering. The rock has broken down into smaller pieces. Now these smaller pieces can be carried over by running water, it can be carried away by wind, it can be carried away by waves, by glaciers, by groundwater. Now these are known as agents of erosion. Running water, groundwater, glaciers, waves, currents, and winds. They are known as agents of erosion. So they will erode all the weathered material with them and they will take it somewhere. So they are following that path of erosion, taking that course of erosion along with them. After that, when the eroded material becomes very heavy, there is a point when these agents cannot carry the load anymore and it results in deposition. So जब वो डिपॉजिट हो जाता है, जहां पे इरोडेड मटेरियल, वेदर्ड मटेरियल डिपॉजिट होता है, again it gives rise to many landforms. These are known as deposition. So erosion and deposition se mainly we see a lot of landforms over here. To help you best understand weathering and erosion and deposition, I can give you the example of a river which is flowing from a slope, from a height, flowing from a mountain. So what happens is, there are three courses in the river: the upper course, the middle course, and the lower course. In the upper course, the velocity is the highest. So what happens at this time? Water carries a lot of silt, sand, clay. These are the weathered material. So the weathering of which has happened either because of physical, chemical, or biological weathering. So all the weathered material, the running water will erode it, carry it with it, throughout the course. In the middle course, what happens is the volume of the water is the highest. So at this time, because the volume of water is more, the eroded material is also more. When the river comes down to the lower course and it merges with the sea or the ocean, it can no longer carry the weight and it leads into the results in the deposition of these weathered material. So we are going to look at weathering right now. First, we look at mechanical weathering. Okay. Now, what do we mean by mechanical weathering? Again, basically breaking of rock into smaller pieces. Now, one thing that you need to remember in mechanical weathering is that the rocks are just, falling apart. There is no change in its chemical composition, no change in any minerals or any, uh, anything, any chemical that it carries. It just stays that way. It's only breaking down. The chemical composition is not being altered at all. Mechanical weathering is most commonly seen in arid climates or in dry climates. So when we are talking about deserts, mechanical weathering is more active. Now, reasons. Why does mechanical weathering take place? Mechanical weathering takes place because of 5 reasons: temperature, frost, crystal growth, release of pressure and water. The logic behind all of this is the same. First, coming to temperature. Now what happens is that a rock contains of many minerals. Now when there is a lot of heat, the minerals keep on expanding, and when the temperature decreases towards the night, the minerals, they again contract. So this expansion and contraction keeps on continuing. Because of this continuous expansion and contraction, a lot of tension develops in the rocks, because of which it leads to cracks in the rocks. And these cracks then finally break down into small pieces. This is how the decomposition starts. So that's about temperature. Next, going to frost. Frost is again the same. When water freezes, its volume increases. So what happens is that, there are always faults and cracks in rocks as well. So water seeps through them. When it seeps through them and when towards the night the temperature decreases, it, the water freezes. And so the water between the crack will also freeze. When the water freezes, the volume of the water will increase. When the volume of water will increase and it will freeze, the pressure will increase. again resulting in the breaking of the rocks. Okay. Next, coming to crystal growth. Now, what happens during crystal growth is that sometimes in many rocks, some materials are soluble and some are not soluble. Now, when alkaline water enters the cracks in these rocks, all the soluble materials get dissolved. When these soluble materials get dissolved, it leads to holes in the rock. And then once the soluble materials have finally become soluble, and then the water evaporates, it leaves holes on the rocks. Now these holes, they look like a honeycomb. So you must have seen many rocks which have a lot of holes, and you wonder why is the rock like this. It's mainly because of this crystal growth, wherein the soluble materials get dissolved and the water evaporates. Next is release of pressure. This is basically what we've already done in frost and temperature. What happens is, because of the continuous expansion and contraction of minerals, because of temperature and frost, the pressure is released, which leads to weathering. Another thing that we need to remember over here is that the outer layers of the rock also continuously put pressure on the inner layers of the rock. Okay. And last is water. We know that when water penetrates the rock, okay, the particles become very loose and they detach itself from the main rocks. Now this is mainly true of sedimentary rocks. They are very sandy. So what happens is, when water goes into the sedimentary rocks, the inner the small particles, they break loose and then they separate from the main rock. So these particles which get loose, they are known as they look like grains. And so this type of weathering, which happens only because of water in sedimentary rocks, it is known as granular weathering. Okay. Now next we come to the types of mechanical weathering. What are the types of mechanical weathering? There are three main types: exfoliation, block disintegration, and shattering. We will look at the pictures of all of them. Coming to exfoliation first, this is like a pressure release. So what happens is, see, this is the exposed part of the rock. Now this exposed part of the rock, it gets more heat than the inner part. अंदर के part पे heat नहीं है, only the outer rock is facing the heat. Now because of this, what happens is, the outer layer of the rock falls apart faster because of the action of temperature, contraction and expansion. So see, here you can see on this part, the top layer is broken down and it's sliding down. Here it is still cracked. Okay. So this is what happens in exfoliation. The outer layers crack and they move apart, and then we have the inner layer coming up. Next, we come to block disintegration. Now this is slightly different from exfoliation. In exfoliation, the main agent which is leading to weathering is temperature. In block disintegration, it is both temperature and water which is acting together. Okay. Now what happens is, this is a continuous, say this was a continuous piece of rock. Now because of temperature, expansion and contraction happens, and it leads to faults, fractures and cracks in the rocks. Now water enters into these faults and cracks, accumulates over there, and then again this expansion and contraction is continuously, acting and widening the joints or widening the faults between the rocks. Now this leads to the rocks separating from each other, and this is then known as block disintegration. So here you can see how the blocks have disintegrated from the rest. Okay. So next we come to shattering. Shattering, mainly water and temperature, somehow both are responsible for shattering as well. Shattering occurs only in cold climates when where there is a lot of ice and temperature reaches freezing point. Okay. Now what happened is, again because of cracks inside the rock, water goes inside these rocks. It freezes, it thaws, and again when it is bright, the temperature rises. The water again melts. The freezed thing melts. Then again, as the temperature goes down, the water starts freezing. So again, expansion and contraction take place, and so ultimately the big stone breaks away into these small stones like this. Shattering is also called frost shattering and freeze thaw weathering. Okay, so shattering takes place only in areas of where we have ice or snowfall. All right, so after mechanical weathering, we move to chemical weathering. Now, in chemical weathering, obviously there are changes in the minerals. There are minerals present in the rocks when they interact, and then there are changes in the chemical structure of the rocks. Okay, so chemical weathering is mainly caused by rainwater. Now, what happens is this rainwater interacts with the minerals inside the rocks. Sometimes they form new minerals, sometimes they become soluble salts, uh, and then reactions also occur when water is a little acidic. So chemical weathering takes place more in humid areas which have a lot of rainfall. Mechanical was in arid areas. Similarly, chemical weathering is more present in the humid areas. Now there are three main types of chemical weathering: carbonation, solution, and oxidation. So let us look at all of them. This is carbonation. So what happens is basically carbonation is the mixing of water with carbon dioxide, and which in turn makes carbonic acid. Okay. Now this leads to the formation of caves. What happens is the stones over here on this side, ultimately weathering takes place and there is a cavity like this, so which is a cave. So carbonation leads to the making up of caves. So what happens is the carbon dioxide that is dissolved in rainwater or even moist air, for example, it leads to the formation of carbonic acid. This carbonic acid reacts with the minerals in the earth, and then it leads to weathering ultimately. Next, coming to solution. So solution, you can see it's like a hollow created. So let's say this rock around it was hard rock, this was soft rock, which reacted with water or moist air, and then it led to a cavity like this. Here again, this is an example of solution. So what happens is alkalis in the rock dissolve and the rocks become brittle, because of which they keep on breaking down. Solution is mainly active mostly in areas where we have limestone. Okay, so limestone is very quick to act with moist air or water. Last year we come to oxidation. Oxidation, you can see there's this brownish reddish color that all the rocks, all the mountains and etc. The sand over here have got this reddish color. So now what happens is if the rocks have iron, and if this comes into contact with water, then iron and oxygen come together and they form rust, and that is how they get this color. Okay, so that's how it gets this reddish color. So basically, chemical weathering is when it alters the minerals inside the earth's surface or on the earth's surface, and then it results in carbonation or it results in oxidation or solution. Okay, and last we have biological weathering. Now, biological weathering is mainly caused or only caused by fauna and flora, that is either because of animals or plants. Sometimes what happens is there is a rock and the roots of a tree are strong, and then if the tree grows this way, then the rock keeps on breaking like this. Then there are burrowing animals which again lead to the disintegration of rocks. So it's a very slow process, but biological weathering happens mainly because of fauna and flora. Okay. So now that weathering is done, we need to understand where does all this weathered material go. Once the weathering is done, what happens with the weathered stuff? So now for this, we have mass movements. There are rapid mass movements and slow mass movements. Okay. First, coming to rapid mass movements. Rapid means they are very, very fast. Rapid movements occur in humid climate where the climate is very moist, air is very moist, and also on slopes that are steep like this. Okay. Now, whenever there is rapid mass movement, there are two possibilities. Either the land or the thing that is weathered, the stuff that is weathered, either it will move down like a landslide, okay, or it will just settle in situ. Settle in situ matlab something like this, see, something like slumping. Slumping is settling in situ. It just falls down where it was. It doesn't go anywhere. So the soil just slumps. Even here, see, it just slumps like this. So these are rapid mass movements. Then we come to slow mass movements. Now, slow movements occur more in dry climates and where the slopes are gentle. See here, the slope is very gentle. Even here, if you see, the slope is very gentle. Now, this slow mass movement is also known as solifluction. This solifluction occurs, it's like a downhill movement where the sediments are moving down, and it's mostly seen in periglacial areas where there's a lot of snowfall, where there is ice. So solifluction is found over there. What happens in solifluction is that the upper layer is fine, the snow has melted, but the lower layer is permanently frozen. See, you can look at this, it looks blue, and these are ice, these are snow. So this is completely frozen, permanently frozen. Solifluction happens mostly in the tundra regions. So what happens is, because the slope is also very gentle and the bottom layer is permanently frozen, small layers of soil, see, you can see this is a layer of soil, then again it's green, again a layer of soil, again green, again a layer of soil. So soil very slowly slides down. So this is solifluction. Okay. So this was the part one where we did weathering. Okay, so when we did weathering, we looked at three types of weathering: mechanical or physical, chemical and biological. Mechanical is mainly because of temperature, frost, and their continuous expansion and contraction. It does not change the rock stays the same way, its chemical composition is not altered. Coming to chemical weathering, what happens in chemical weathering is the chemicals of the rock are changing continuously. And the last is biological weathering, which is mainly caused by flora and fauna. And then we come to the mass movements, which can be rapid or slow. Right? So again, take 2 minutes. If there's anything, please put it on chat. Any doubts, please put it on chat. Okay, Esas, what we mean by mass movements is the weathered stuff has to go somewhere. It cannot be where it is. Okay, so what happens with the weathered stuff is that either it will move very fast, okay, or it will move very slowly. Now, whether it moves fast or it moves slow depends on the physiography, the temperature, the frost, all the other geographical factors of that area. When it comes to rapid movement, okay, the rapid mass movements, that entire mass of weathered material will move very quickly. So either it will move down a slope or it will just sink where it is. So when it sinks right where it is known as in situ. Okay, so it just goes down into a hollow. That is a rapid mass movement. When it comes to slow mass movements occur in glacial areas and periglacial areas where the lower layer of soil is always frozen. It's permanently frozen. So because of this, what happens is that the rock on top are very hard, and it results only in the movement which is very slow. So that is rapid and slow. So, difference between exfoliation and shattering. Okay. Now, exfoliation and shattering are both mechanical type of weathering. In exfoliation, we only have temperature which is acting. In shattering, we have temperature and water both acting. Okay. Exfoliation takes place in areas where it does not come in contact with water, सिर्फ temperature और वो rock. When we are talking of shattering, in shattering we have water and temperature both responsible. When it comes to difference between block integration and shattering, the common thing is that both include water and temperature. But shattering takes place only in frozen areas. Block integration never takes place in frozen areas. Block integration will take place in and around your seas, in and around your oceans, in and around your rivers and lakes and all of that. Shattering will always take place in frozen areas. That's the difference, Soham. If it's clear, just type OK. Yeah. All right. So let's move with the part 2 of exogenetic processes. This is the last thing we are looking at. Here we are basically going to look at the landforms that are formed, which now the weathering is done. In this chapter, exogenetic processes part 2, we will be looking at erosion and deposition. Now, what are the landforms formed because of erosion and what are the landforms formed because of deposition? So we are going to look at all of that, and we are going to go through all the agents of erosion and the agents of deposition. So let's start. First are the landforms formed by rivers. So your the agent of erosion is your running water. Okay. Now, when we talk about landforms formed by rivers, the landforms formed due to erosion. So when the erosion work is going on, the landforms that are formed are gorges, waterfall, and V-shaped valleys. Gorge is nothing but an I-shaped valley. So let us look at each one of them. Now this is a gorge, okay? It's a deep valley. It's very deep and it's very narrow. So you look, it's very narrow. Okay, so it's a deep valley. It's a narrow valley. What happens is this was rock over years, over lakhs of years, millions of years. Water keeps on eroding this vertically. So because of water, the the rocks ka weathering keeps on taking place. So continuously there is weathering, and ultimately what happens is water will also get through hard rocks and it will be standing straight like this. So this is also known as an I-shaped valley because it looks like the letter I. It's straight down. It does not have a V shape like a valley. It's a straight valley. Okay. Indus, Satluj, Brahmaputra, they have a lot of gorges. Okay, where they cross the Himalayas, they have a lot of gorges like this. So it's like an I-shaped valley. Moving next, these are waterfalls. Now what happens in a waterfall is that the water is flowing from a height. Now where the rock suddenly cuts, what will happen is because of gravity, the water will fall down. This then forms a waterfall. Now a waterfall can be at a great height, or it can be at a medium height, or it can be very average. So whenever there is a cut in the slope of the water, say for example the rock ends, the result will be a waterfall. So this is how waterfalls are formed. Very scenic, very beautiful to look at. A lot of tourist attractions. Niagara Falls, for example, it's just falling suddenly, so it's known as a waterfall. Next is a V-shaped valley. So you will notice how this is different from a gorge. Okay, this is like a valley over here. Now, V-shaped valleys, mostly you can see them in mountainous regions, you can see them in hilly regions. So the area basically between two mountains or between two hills will become a V-shaped valley. Okay. At times, there are rivers going through the valleys. At times, not necessary that always you will see a river going in between the V-shaped valley. Okay. So at times in the V-shaped valley, there's a river also flowing through, but it normally has a small volume of water. But even though the volume is small, it has a lot of erosive power. So these are the landforms. You have your, because formed due to erosion, gorge, waterfall, and V-shaped valley. Okay. Now we look at the landforms formed due to deposition. Now all this material that has been eroded has to be deposited somewhere. So when we talk about landforms formed due to deposition, we have alluvial fans, meanders, flood leaves, floodplains, and deltas. So let's look at all of them. Alluvial fan. Now what happens is water is falling down a height, and ultimately there's a point when it reaches the ground. It can no longer carry the silt, the sand, the gravel, and what happens is it is all deposited over here. Okay. So when the water is flowing, it is carrying all sorts of gravel and silt. When it reaches at the bottom, finally, it deposits all of the load over here and the water will flow out of this freely. Okay. So this is an alluvial fan. It looks like this. Alluvial soil, extremely rich in minerals. So alluvial fans are really, looked forward to by farmers. The most fertile soil. So these are alluvial fans. They're mostly like a triangle shape. Next, we go to meanders. Now, we normally see meanders in the middle course of the river where the volume of water is very high. Now, what happens is the water will flow as per the topography of that area. So, water will make its own path. Sometimes what happens is the water will flow like this. It forms its own path. These are naturally formed. So, wherever it finds place, it will form on its own. So, sometimes they form these broad curves or loops. So these loops that look like this, they are called meanders. Now sometimes what happens is because of excessive sedimentation, this meander will break away from here and it will give rise to an oxbow lake, an independent oxbow lake, and then the river would change its course and continue to flow. Okay, next we come to flood leaves and flood plains. Now they both come together. Agar flood leaves nahi hai to flood plains nahi, flood plains nahi hai to flood leaves nahi. Now what happens is you can see this is the river flowing over here. What happens is when there's rainy season, the volume of water increases. When the volume of water increases, water will overflow from the main path of the river. So this river will overflow and it will flood the surrounding areas. Now these surrounding areas that it floods, so where you see this flood plain till here, till the light green area, our water will come till here. Okay. When there is a lot of volume in the water. Now, when the water will go out, it will obviously carry with it all the sand, the silt, the clay. So this entire area, this is known as the flood plain, which is a plain, which is an area where the river can overflow safely. This is our flood plain. Now, when the water volume decreases, the water will again recede from here and it will go into its main channel. Now, when the water goes into its main channel, on its edges, it will leave all these sediments that have built up. Okay. And then the water will go inside. So these sediments that gather on the edges of the river are known as flood leaves. Okay. So it acts like a natural elevation. So these are your flood leaves. So flood leaves and flood plains are similar things. Last, we go to deltas. I'm sure you all will be familiar with deltas. So what happens is as the river approaches the lower course, as it approaches the sea, as it approaches the ocean, the river will drain out into the sea. At this time, the flow of the river becomes very slow. The velocity becomes very slow because all through the upper course and the middle course, it has carried a lot of weathered material. Now it's the time where it can no longer hold that weight and it has to deposit it somewhere. So it deposits it exactly at the point where it is draining out into the sea. Now what happens is sediments can be formed anywhere, and water will again make its own path. Where a lot of sediments are finally formed, they will just go in and around. So the river splits into small distributaries over here because of the gathered sand, silt and clay, and finally drain out into the sea. Okay. So these distributaries again in the shape of a triangle, these are known as deltas. So deltas are the areas yes, Adinath, floodplains are kind of a little low. So if you can see, you know, if you can see this area is raised. So it's always kept like that for safety most of the times. Not always, but most of the times. And so these are deltas where the river finally drains into the sea. All right. So these are the landforms formed by rivers by deposition and erosion. Let us just quickly take a look again. So the ones that are formed due to erosion are gorges like an eye-shaped valley, waterfall, and a V-shaped valley. Landforms formed due to deposition, we have alluvial fans, meanders, flood leaves and flood plains, and we have deltas. Okay. Now moving on to the landforms that are formed by glaciers. We know glaciers are always in areas which experience a lot of snowfall. There's a lot of ice, so frost acts a lot over here. Now, landforms that are formed due to erosion. There are so many of them: cirques, U-shaped valley, arêtes, horns, hanging valley, rocher mountains. So let us look at each one of them. Now these are cirques. This area over here, this is called a cirque. Okay, it's like a half open hollow at one side of the valley, or or on a mountain side. So it just breaks like this, and there's snow over there. It's formed by the erosion of glaciers. How? By the erosion of glaciers. So when the water melts, again the running water will result in weathering and also in erosion. So okay, these things that are formed over here are known as cirques. It's like a half open steep hollow next to a mountain or at the head of a valley. These are cirques. You cannot see the screen. Anyone else who cannot see the screen? Okay, I've stopped share and I'm sharing it again. Okay. Yeah, so these were cirques. I hope you all saw this. Okay. Next, we are going to the U-shaped valley. Now, valleys which are formed by glaciers, they are normally steep and the bottoms are flat. Okay. It looks like a letter U, like a wide U. So see, these are comparatively steep and the bottom is flat. So that is when they are known as a U-shaped valley. In a V-shaped valley, what was happening is the slopes are gentle and the bottoms are not steep. Sorry, the bottoms are not flat. In U-shaped valley, the sides are steep and bottoms are flat. Now coming to arêtes. Now these pointed areas that you see over here, these, okay, all these lines over here, they are called arêtes. Now it separates two glacial valleys. So see here it's like a hollow, here again it's like a hollow. So when it's separating these cirques, etc., these are known as arêtes. Okay, fine, let's go back. Okay, so just to give you a quick recap. So this is the exogenetic processes part 2, where we are going to concentrate on the landforms formed by erosion and deposition. These are the landforms formed by rivers. Landforms formed due to erosion. We have a gorge, which is like an eye-shaped valley. Water flows through this, and because of the water, there's continuous erosion of these rocks at the bottom. So this is a gorge. Waterfall, when the rock, the rock, there is a sudden cut in the rock, the water, because of gravity, will fall down. That is known as a waterfall. V-shaped valley, these are not very steep. Okay, the slopes are very gentle in a V-shaped valley. So V-shaped valley can be found between any two hills or any two mountains. You are going to find a V-shaped valley. Landforms formed due to deposition of rivers. We have alluvial fans. When the river reaches the lower course and it has to deposit all its sand and gravel and all of that, the result will be an alluvial fan. It looks like this. Next is meanders. Meanders can be seen in the middle course of the rivers. The water will follow its own course, and so sometimes they follow this pattern which is curved, or they follow these loops. So that then are known as meanders. Then you have flood leaves and flood plains. What happens is, when the volume of water increases at times due to rainy season, the water comes out and floods its surrounding areas because the volume increases. Okay. Now these are known as flood plains, the area in which the river floods. When finally the volume of water decreases and water recedes into its main channel, it will leave sand, sediments, gravel, silt, clay, all of that on the edges of the river. These are known as flood leaves. Deltas, when the river is finally draining into the sea or the ocean, it deposits all of the sediments that it has carried all along, and the river breaks into small distributaries and looks like this. This is known as a delta. Then we came to the landforms formed by glaciers. Now the landforms that were formed by glaciers due to erosion are Surgs, U-shaped valley, Arret, Horn, Hanging Valley, and Roshi Mountain. Now what are Surgs? Surgs are these, they are very half open. See, this kind is, here it's like a normal hill, but here it's open. So it's like a half open steep hollow at the head of a valley normally, that's a Surg. U-shaped valley are very steep and the bottom is flat. They are known as U-shaped valleys. Arrets. So arrets are these pointed, these pointed areas that you see. They are known as arrets. They basically separate two hollows from each other. So these are the arrets, the pointed edges of this. Next, coming to horns. Now, what happens is, horns and arrets are quite similar. For example, take this one, take this point over here where my arrow can be seen. Now, when the weathering of this will be over, this side of the arret, this side of the arret, and this side of the arret. Over here, when this part will be eroded and deposited somewhere else, this will stand alone like a horn like this. So this is like a horn. So, when three or more arrets around it are eroded, it's a sharp peak that can be seen, and that is known as a horn. Okay. So next, this is a hanging valley. Okay. Hanging valley is like a side valley. It's normally on the edges. It enters a main valley. You can see this is a main valley over here. This is just a valley on the edge, but it's higher than the main valley. It means that it's slightly more heighted than the other part of the valley. This happens because of glacial erosion. When the side of the valley is not very eroded and the main valley keeps on being eroded, the result is a hanging valley like this. It's always on the edges of valleys that this happens. Now next we come to a Roche mountain. The Roche mountain, you can see, okay, the spelling is actually Mouton, we call it mountains. It's a very, it's a very small type of a mountain, not a mountain exactly, just something that looks like this. formed again because of glacial erosion. What happens over here is that the one side is very, very smooth, whereas the other side is very steep, it is very rough and very irregular. So you can see over here that this in the photo down as well. Here the right hand side is very smooth. See, it's quite smooth. But if you see the left hand side, it's very rocky, it's very patchy, it's very rough, and it's comparatively steep. This is steep, whereas this side is gentle. So these are known as Roche mountains. Okay. Now the landforms formed due to deposition. What are the landforms formed because of deposition of glaciers? We have drumlins, moraines, and eskers. Now, moraines are of four types: ground moraine, lateral moraine, medial moraine, and terminal moraine. Let us look at all of them. These are drumlins. Okay. They are elongated, like they are jutting out, heading out. Elongated, it's like a teardrop shape. See, looks like a teardrop. Okay, it's like small hills of rocks. They are made of sand, rock, and gravel, which keep on moving under the glacial ice. Now, these drumlins at times can be very long. They can also be long up to 2 kilometers. Now, here we have, see, these are the moraines that we have. Now, what happens is when the glaciers descend down, the ice, the snow melts because the climate gets warmer. Now, when it melts, again, the water has a lot of load consisting of clay, sand, gravel, etc. It cannot carry this weight anymore, and so ultimately it drops all this weight. So when all these weights are deposited, they are known as moraines. Now, we have four types of moraines. Here you can see the lateral moraines. They are pointed over here like this. They are only on the side of the glacier. So you see, these are the glaciers at the sides of the glaciers. These are the lateral moraines on the sides. Then we have the terminal moraine down over here. This is terminal moraine. It is the end point of the moraine. Means the all the sediments can be carried only up to this point. Beyond this, it cannot be carried. So the terminal moraines are also called end moraines. Then you have this ground moraine. Okay. So this is the ground moraine is between the lateral and the medial moraines and just before the terminal moraine. So where you have the maximum load deposited, that is known as your ground moraine. And last we have the medial moraines. These are the medial moraines. See, so the ones in the middle are called medial moraines. They are parallel to your lateral moraines. See, medial moraines are always parallel to the lateral moraines. So these are the type of moraines that we have. And finally, eskers. Now see, these glaciers are stagnant. So these things that you see, this long one that you see over here, these are eskers. So it's a long and a narrow mound. It's made up of sand and gravel, and it's deposited over here. Okay, it gets deposited on the side and it doesn't move. So eskers can either be beneath the glaciers or on top of the glaciers like this. They don't move, they just stay that way. Okay. Next, we come to landforms formed by the wind, moving wind. Now, landforms that are formed by the wind is most active in arid climates, in dry climates. So most of your landforms formed by winds are found in arid and dry climates. Now, lands that are formed due to erosion, we have mushroom rocks, deflation hollows, yardungs, and hamada. Coming to mushroom rocks. Now, what happens is some rocks, the rock at the bottom is soft rock, while the rock at the top is hard rock. So, because of continuous erosion, because the bottom had soft rock, it gets eroded comparatively fast and easily, while the hard rock on top stands strong like this. So the bottom rock is eroded and the top rock stays this way. So this makes it look like a mushroom, and so it is called a mushroom rock. Now these are deflation hollows. Now what happens in deserts, wind is continuously blowing and sand being light is carried very easily by the wind. So what deflation hollows are, that the wind carries the sand to a point where the particles over here are very heavy for the wind to move. So all the top layer of the sand is moved completely, and when it results in a cavity like this, these are known as blowouts or deflation hollows. So the particles down over here are too heavy for the wind to carry. Now these are yardungs. These that you see over here, these are yardungs. Now yardungs are normally found in areas where water is scarce and the winds are very strong, and the winds flow very close to the surface of the earth, and they generally erode the hills. These were hills originally, but because the wind blows down, they keep on eroding it. So only the hard rock of these hills continues to be like this, and so they are called yardungs. They look like separate hills now. Last is hamada. Now see, it looks something like this. You can see there are bigger rocks also. What happens over here in this area, the most of the sand on top of it has been removed because of the deflation or the blowouts that take place. What is left is seen like this. Now these are big stones, so obviously they cannot be carried by the wind. So these areas are known as hamadas. Okay. Next we go to the landforms formed due to deposition of sand. Now the eroded sand has to be deposited somewhere. So what we find is sand dunes, barchans, sieves, ripple marks, and lowest plain. These are sand dunes. I'm sure you must have all seen these sand dunes. So what happens is when the speed of the wind decreases, or when there is some obstacle in the path of the wind, all the eroded material has to be deposited somewhere. Now because this sand is deposited, it leads to the formation of sand dunes. So sand dunes are like low level hills of sand. Here we have barchans. Barchans is again a type of sand dune, but it's like a crescent shaped sand dune. Okay. Why is this taking place? Because there might be some obstacle over here, because of which the sand has taken this shape. Next we have sieves. Sieves are like these long sand dunes. Again, this happens because of the movement of the wind. So they are like straight sand dunes, like this. Next we have ripple marks. Ripple marks are always found on sand. So these are like small wavy lines of sand. They look like waves. Okay, they form perpendicular to the wind direction. So the wind is blowing like this, so they will always be at 90 degrees with the flow of the wind. And it is normally, see, they are at equal distance, okay, from each other. So these are the ripple marks that can be found. And last is lowest plain. Now what happens in lowest plain is that the finest particles of the sand that have been eroded, they are carried very farther away. They can travel a lot of distance because the sand is very, very light. So this sand is carried or eroded by the wind or much beyond the deserts. And then when these winds reach humid areas, the humid climate, the moist air and the sand reacts. The sand becomes heavy, and ultimately the sand is deposited in humid regions. So this is what it looks like. So these are lowest plains. Okay. Next we go to sea waves. The landforms that are formed by sea waves. Again, landforms formed because of erosion and then deposition. Here we have wave cut platform, sea cliffs, sea caves, sea arches, headlands, and stacks. Let's look at each one of them. So see, this is a wave cut platform. Okay. So what happens is, this is hard rock. The rock that has stayed behind at the bottom is hard rock. Now this was soft rock. Because the waves are continuously crashing, so this area that you see covered the area, or this covered the entire area, but so much of rock has been eroded. Okay. So gradually, because of continuous waves, the cliff is worn away and it keeps on being pushed inside. Now this flat area that is formed over here are known as wave cut platform. Why did this happen? Because these rocks were comparatively softer rocks, whereas these were hard rocks. So soft rock is eroded fast, hard rock is taking time. Next we go to sea caves. Okay. Now what happens is sometimes this is like a sea cliff and the rock over here is soft rock. So what happens is that the waves scoop out holes like this, which make it look like caves. Because the water or the waves hit the bottom part of the cliff. Because of that, the erosion or the weathering is highest at the bottom level whenever we are talking about sea waves. So that's the reason you have these caves formed like this. Then we have sea arches. It's like a natural arch. Okay. Again, this rock was soft, so it got cut out. And this rock is hard, so it is still standing. Headlands. Now, headlands are these areas jutting out. Okay. These were soft rocks, they got eroded. This is hard rock, did not get eroded, and so it is standing out as a strong headland. Sea cliffs. Okay. So this is like the coast is really rocky over here. The slope is very, very steep. It's like a vertical wall. See, it's right from here. You can see it's a vertical wall, almost 90 degrees straight. Okay, so it's because of erosion, it will keep on being pushed inside. These are sea cliffs. Now, for example, if the bottom rock is soft, then it will result in a wave cut platform like this. It can also form sea caves like this. See, these are also sea caves over here. These are caves over here. So many landforms can exist together at the same time. These are stacks. Okay. Now what happens is when you have these arches, let's say this arch also falls down, or when you have this cave, this part. If this part also falls down, then this stone over here is going to stand independently like a stack over here. So this arch which joined both the stones are going to fall apart like this. So these are stacks standing individually. Next we go to landforms formed because of deposition. We have beaches, sandbars and lagoons. So all the eroded material that is carried by the water have to be deposited somewhere. So first is a beach. So eroded material along the waves comes and they are deposited over here and it forms a beach, mostly made of sand, gravel, pebbles, okay, which are brought by the waves. Then we have sandbars. Now sandbars are away from the coast. What happens is the depth of the water as we come towards the coast decreases. So because of this sand and gravel, it gets deposited on the sea floor and it looks somewhat like that. And this is how sandbars are formed. As you can see over here, the depth is not so much for the water. So all you can see is sand. This is how sandbars are formed. Now, sometimes what happens when there are sandbars, these sandbars, they kind of enclose one part of the coast and what it gives rise to a lagoon. So these are sandbars over here, okay? And they kind of separated a part of the sea and that becomes a lagoon. Okay. And this over here then looks like a beach. So a lagoon is not as big as a beach. Now last we come to the landforms formed by groundwater. We know there is groundwater and continuous erosion, weathering takes place because of this groundwater. And the landforms that are formed because of erosion of groundwater, we have sinkholes and limestone caves. Now this is a sinkhole. You can see that the top layer has been weathered and eroded and it is deposited somewhere. Okay. So this is a cavity that takes place in the ground. It always takes place wherever there is limestone. Okay. So it's caused by the erosion of groundwater. And what happens is sinkholes are in a way good because you can also have access to the groundwater from these sinkholes. So again, land water, rainwater acts, carbonation, and all of that takes place. And there's a cavity, it's a sinkhole, and we have access to groundwater. Next, we have these limestone caves. Okay. Now, when these limestone caves form, when water seeps through the surface of the earth to the inside, And if there is limestone down, then it gets dissolved, and then we have the formation of limestone caves. And last, because of the landforms formed because of deposition of groundwater, we have stalactites and stalagmites. Okay, this is how stalactites and stalagmite looks. So they are like stalactites. Stalactites are those that are hanging from the roof. They are like calcium salt deposits because of dripping water, and then they finally freeze. Stalagmites are the ones on the ground. Okay, it's due to the accumulation of the same calcium salts which are dropping from the ceiling. So when they reach the ground, they form these kind of peaks, and sometimes they hang from the ground like hang from the roof like this. So these are stalactites and stalagmites. So groundwater landforms are most active whenever there is the presence of limestone. Okay, so we complete with these chapters over here. So what we've done today is the endogenic and the exogenic processes and the distribution maps. Now, if you have any doubts, you can ask me or you can leave the session.